Well, great to have you. Very pleased to share today's discussion with Joel and Hisham, and great to see many friends and colleagues around the table. So the story I have to tell today is basically how labor activism in Egypt has been declining in the last 4 years. It's actually a story on how repression works, on what kind of techniques and tools are used by the current government in Egypt to curb, to contain, to restrict, to limit labor activism. The two key words I would like to start with are demobilization and depoliticization. Approaching 2011, especially between 2004 and 2011, before the democratic uprising in January 2011, Egypt witnessed a clear rise of labor activism, protest activities by industrial workers, by workers in the public as well as in the private sector, as well as by civil servants. There was a gradual rise of protest activities against the background of deteriorating social and economic conditions, a rise of protest activities in which workers and civil servants put forward economic and social demands primarily, but as well political demands pertaining to freedom of association and freedom of expression. That rise, which actually was echoed by a similar rise in protest activism in Egypt in general by civil society organizations, networks of young activists, pro-democracy activists, and so on and so forth, culminated in the democratic uprising 2011. This broad mobilization continued to unfold in Egypt in 2011 and 2012. Once a democratic experiment or the brief democratic opening came to an end in July 2013, the government, the post-2013 government, its main objective was to drive back that popular mobilization, which was a key part of Egyptian reality between 2004 and all the way to 2013. The second key word I would like to start with is depoliticization. And what I mean here is that this government has been using a variety of strategies and techniques aiming not only to limit and restrict labor activism, but to push workers, activists among civil servants away from putting forward political and wider demands into depoliticizing the movement and getting the movement to be focused on economic and social demands. I'm not saying that these economic and social demands are less important, but it's a structural change which is happening. And it's important to keep in mind that whereas the labor movement in Egypt, activism among civil servants, was able to tackle both economic and social demands as well as political demands before 2013, increasingly the picture we're looking at as of today is of labor activists, active civil servants tackling primarily, if any, economic and social demands and facing a great deal of government restrictions, if not outright repression. As I was just saying before 2013, there were attempts by the two administrations which controlled Egyptian politics after the resignation of former President Mubarak by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which controlled the executive power between February 11, 2011 and the summer of 2012, and later by the government of former elected President Mohamed Morsi, which controlled the executive branch of government between the summer of 2012 and the military coup in July 2013. Both administrations were not happy with the levels of labor activism and the protests which were still occurring in Egypt, and attempted to use some legal measures to curtail labor activism and protest activities of civil servants. Let me remind all of us of some of the figures, just to share numbers, to put some numbers on the working class in Egypt as well as civil servants. The total number of Egyptian workers and civil servants is 27 million. So the workforce as of today, and today is the last, based on the last statistics, the last census, in fact, released a few weeks ago by the Central Auditing Agency. So the Egyptian workforce is 27 million strong. Within that figure, we have 6.6 million Egyptians employed by the state bureaucracy, civil servants. I would push it a bit up from 6.6 to 7 million. So if we leave aside the government figures, non-governmental figures are around 7 million. So 7 million out of 27 million are employed by the state bureaucracy as civil servants. The remaining 21 million, we have 24% employed in the public sector and 76% employed in the private sector. 24% employed in the public sector remains relatively high in regional comparison as well as in global comparison, but when we look at the history of Egypt, number of Egyptians employed in the public sector has been gradually declining since the 1970s. So between 2011 and 2013, there were attempts by SCAF as well as by the elected government of former President Mohamed Morsi to curb labor protests and protest activities of civil servants. The legal measures used were primarily issuing a presidential decree, which was issued by SCAF. SCAF, back then controlling the executive branch of government, had the prerogative of issuing presidential decree laws. And so a presidential decree law was issued in 2012 delegalizing labor strikes. There were attempts by the two administrations to shape an anti-protest official narrative, which focused on the fact that protesting workers and protesting civil servants are pursuing special interests. So I'm referring to some of the key words that were used back then in Arabic. So special interests, undermining stability, undermining the Egyptian economy, productivity levels were declining, and so on and so forth. However, the wider mobilization which continued in Egypt in 2011 and 2012 made it very hard for SCAF as well as for the Morsi government to punish protesting workers or to move beyond putting forward legal measures and an official anti-protest narrative into penalizing labor activism. That did not happen, and therefore, for example, in 2012, a total of 3,817 protest activities, so primarily strikes as well as sit-ins in the workplace took place. When we compare that number to 2011-2010, there was an increase, if I'm not mistaken, of around 20%. So that was a clear reflection of the democratic opening which was happening in Egypt. Interesting to note as well is that within that number, 3,817 protests, almost 40% of the protests were driven by political demands. These were not only protests driven by economic and social demands, salary-related or wage-related issues, or financial demands, or protection of workers and civil servants in the workplace. Some of them were driven by wider demands for freedom of expression, freedom of association, and working class as well as civil servants were part of the wider mobilization and wider push for a greater political opening in Egypt.
Are we supposed to read all that?
No, of course not. No, of course not. No, please do not. No. Okay. Do not read them. I'm going to walk you through the main points. So. July 2013 comes, the military coup takes place, and what happens after it is quite remarkable at two levels. So the new government, the military security controlled government, was quick in attempting to undermine labor activism. So in fact, one of the very first legislative initiatives was addressed to delegalize independent labor unions. Independent labor unions, Egypt since the 1950s, 1960s, lived in times of state co-opted, government co-opted labor unions. There was one general union for Egyptian workers. Independent labor unions, or that principle of union freedom, was not recognized by the Egyptian government. Between 2011 and 2013, that principle, the principle of freedom for unionized workers, the establishment of multiple unions, was recognized by post-2011 governments. One of the first legislative initiatives of the new government after 2013 was to delegalize, to outlaw independent labor unions. And of course, that was against the background of the fact that independent labor unions played a great role in organizing the working class and civil servants. So right after the coup, legislative initiatives were pushed forward by the new government to curtail and limit labor activism. In fact, it didn't help much that even some of the independent labor unions and, in fact, key leaders among working class activists and civil servants activists spoke out in favor of the military coup. In fact, in the first cabinet after the coup, the Minister of Manpower, I mean, that ministry is still called Manpower in Egypt, the first post-coup minister was an independent labor leader by the name of Kamal Abu Aita. And there were different endorsements by independent labor unions, by labor activists, by civil servant activists, not only for the coup, but for the candidacy of the former defense minister, current president Abdel-Fattah Al-Sisi, for the presidency. However, these endorsements and that pro-government approach did not help much. The new government after 2013 was keen on driving back levels of mobilization, and labor activism seemed like the place they wanted to start, along with driving back young Egyptians' activism. And therefore, the two first legislative initiatives were a protest law, basically evacuating citizens out of the public space, penalizing freedom of expression and freedom of association or peaceful protests. And the second legislative initiative was to delegalize independent labor unions. What has been happening since 2013 has been driven by this reading of the current government, its consistent approach to demobilize and to depoliticize with regard to the working class and civil servants. I'm going to spare you some of the information regarding the wider social and economic context in which this push for demobilization and depoliticization is happening, because this is a very tight social and economic environment. Inflation rates, for example, in the beginning of 2017 were around 30%. Right now they are 15% plus. Poverty levels have been on the rise from 27%, according to government figures, to 30% plus. Egypt signed a deal with the IMF, according to which the local currency was devalued, losing almost 50% of its value, according to which subsidies, government subsidies to key commodities such as bread, fuel, electricity, are being lifted gradually. So this is a very tight social and economic environment in which primarily the working class suffers more than anyone else. However, and in that tight social and economic environment, the push for restricting, curbing labor activism has not stopped. And before analyzing how the government has been doing it and sharing why the title of my presentation is Repression Works, let me give you some figures just to see in quantitative measures how this restricting of labor activism and civil servants activism has been unfolding in Egypt. So in 2012, the overall number of protests events was around 3,800. In 2014, the total number came down to 1,655, down from 3,817. In 2015, 933. In 2016, slightly more than 700. Let me note as well, and Joel and I were discussing that before we began, even in terms of reporting labor protests and protests by civil servants, we are increasingly facing a hard time because it's very difficult to report in Egypt because of different limits imposed on freedom of expression, different limits imposed on labor activists as well as on journalists. The level of reporting cannot be compared to what we had between 2011 and 2013 or even before 2011. So we are increasingly looking at gray zones. We do not know exactly how many protests are taking place, but safely one can assume that these figures are more or less accurate. So we have a decrease from 3,817 in 2013 to around 700 in 2016. This represents a decrease of over 70% in the number of protests. A second important issue to keep in mind is a change in nature of these protest activities. So protests are no longer driven to a great extent or to a considerable extent, not only by economic and social demands, but also by political demands. What we're looking at right now is close to 70% of all protests are driven by economic and social demands. Less than 10% are driven by political demands, demands for freedom of expression and freedom of association. And that number of protests in between economic and social protests and protests for political purposes is filled, in fact, by workers and civil servants protesting lacking safeguards at the workplace. So I'm going to share some of the figures regarding arbitrary dismissal of workers, arbitrary dismissals of civil servants, arbitrary transfers, and these measures are increasingly part of the scene, and of course labor activists and civil servants are addressing them. Okay, so what kind of tools has this government been using in demobilizing and depoliticizing the Egyptian working class and Egyptian civil servants? I differentiate between four types of tools: administrative, security, legislative, and judicial. So the administrative tools I'm referring to, some of the tools are old, some of these tools are new. So the first administrative tool used is appeasement, and this is very much part of the traditions of how the government manages in Egypt civil servants and the working class, especially in public facilities. Appeasement by means of settling individual and collective workers' complaints. Almost 1/3 of all complaints between 2013 and 2017 was settled. Workers' individual and collectives complaints are always addressed to financial, economic, and social issues. Salaries which were not paid, benefits which were not given, and so on and so forth. Co-optation, between 2011 and 2013, the leadership of the General Union of Egyptian Workers was removed. The pro-Mubarak leadership was removed, and there, in fact, were elections scheduled several times for the General Union of Egyptian Workers. For different reasons, these elections did not take place before 2013. After 2013, the government reinserted its control over the General Union of Egyptian Workers. So the current leadership of the General Union of Egyptian Workers is a pro-government leadership. In fact, it's very much a government tool in curtailing and curbing labor activism, to the extent that the leadership of the General Union of Egyptian Workers has frequently expressed views regarding labor activism by calling on the government to delegalize, to outlaw all forms of protest for at least a year. So such a legislative initiative did not come even from the government, but the leadership of the union has been calling on the president, on the government to implement. So appeasement, co-optation, and punishment. both in the public facilities as well as in the state bureaucracy, the government has been increasingly resorting to arbitrary transfers and dismissals of active workers and active civil servants. Workers and civil servants who are reported to be part or to participate in protests get dismissed, transferred, or suspended. Between, for example, once again, and here I'm referring and reminding you of the gray zone with regard to reporting. The only figure I could find for the number of dismissed, transferred, or suspended workers and civil servants, recent number is for the period between May 2016 and April 2017. 2,691 workers and civil servants were dismissed, transferred, or suspended in an arbitrary manner. Security tools. So the second set of tools used by the Egyptian government is a set of security tools which include temporary detention of labor activists and protesting civil servants, arrests and imprisonment. Of course, arrest and imprisonment lead to court proceedings against primarily protest leaders. Some of these court proceedings happen in front of military tribunals, so we have a growing number of military trials. In fact, between May 2016 and April 2017, 186 workers and civil servants were put on trial. Among them, 27 have been facing military trials, which continue to unfold as of now. So the two images you can see are for two big protests which happened in 2016. One by the workers of the Public Transportation Agency. Their protests led to arrests and detention of several of the protest leaders, and the picture, the picture above is for workers of the Public Transportation Agency. The picture below is for workers in a cement factory, in a public cement factory, where once again protests driven by economic and social demands, adjusting salaries to inflation rates in 2016 and 2017 led to arrests and transfer of labor activists to courts. Of course, these security tools are being used against the background of a constitution of 2014 in which it's safeguarded the right to peaceful protest, the right to strike, the right to for workers to protest in public as well as in private facilities is enshrined in the constitution. So in spite of constitutional safeguards, the government is implementing its security tools in an unconstitutional manner, which once again, this sort of very little respect of the constitution is unfolding in many spheres in Egypt. The third group of tools used by the government are legislative tools, which I find very interesting. So and this is a great part of what I'm working on now with regard to labor activism, with regard to civil society, and in general how this current government coming after a democratic opening and with its main conclusion that the democratic opening between 2011 and 2013 happened because former President Mubarak let freedom of expression, freedom of association thrive to an extent in civil society arenas with regard to protest dynamics. And so their takeaway is that space which existed before 2011 led to the democratic uprising that they define as a chaotic phase in Egyptian politics, and that the only way to go and move beyond that is to completely close off that space. So closure of civil society, closure of formal politics, closure of labor activism by means of demobilization and depoliticization. So the legislative tools used are in fact built on the legislative prerogatives of the president. Egyptian presidents since the 1950s have always had the right to issue presidential decree laws, and that has been significantly, extensively used by the current president to curb labor activism. And secondly, of course, by virtue of the executive branch of government, the president, and the military and security institutions controlling parliament, using parliament to pass some legislative initiatives as well. So let me highlights in the use of legislative tools are passing a new civil service law approved in 2016 by Parliament, which among different problematic articles, the new civil service law makes it easy to terminate civil servants and to undermine the rights to regular wage increases. And here the government is playing out one of its main cards in controlling behavior of civil servants, threatening to terminate contracts, threatening to undermine the right to regular wage increases. Right now there is a discussion in Parliament about a new labor law, which will basically copy some of the provisions of the civil service law, making it easier for the government to terminate, dismiss or transfer in an arbitrary fashion workers in public facilities. Other laws and legal amendments which are not only addressed to labor activism but are addressed to the wider objective of this government to demobilize and depoliticize and to close off the spaces that existed before 2011 or after 2011 and led to the democratic uprising are the protest law in 2013, the public facilities law in 2014, the judiciary, the military judiciary law, and the penal code. All of these amendments, without getting you into too many details, are tailored to reach two objectives. One, to de-incentivize peaceful protests for all key segments of the Egyptian populace, especially those segments which participated in 2011. So young Egyptians, working class Egyptians, civil servants, as well as pro-democracy activists. And the second objective is to basically undermine constitutional safeguards. It's an interesting feature of current Egyptian realities is while we are having a constitution that is, apart from civil-military relations, overall has a democratic flavor, the safeguards enshrined in the Constitution for social and for political and civil rights are undermined by virtue of issuing laws which contradict the Constitution. And since the executive branch of government controls Parliament, these laws are passed easily, quickly, in most cases even without a serious debate in Parliament. And since this government controls to a great extent courts, there is not much, apart from the Supreme Constitutional Court, which has been challenging some of these laws. Just to give you a case in point, if I'm not mistaken, in the beginning of 2017, the Supreme Constitutional Court ruled that one article of the protest law is unconstitutional, an article which limits the right to organize demonstrations to an acceptance of the security forces ahead of time. So there is a bit of contestation happening primarily in the Supreme Constitutional Court when it comes to these laws and legal amendments. Finally, Egypt is back to the times of the state of emergency. So the state of emergency was declared in 2017, extended according to the Constitution, and unlike previous constitutions, unlike the situation in Egypt before 2011, Egypt lived between 1981 and 2011 in an unsuspended state of emergency for 30 years. The Constitution of 2014 changed articles pertaining to the president or the government declaring the state of emergency into authorizing the government to declare the state of emergency for 3 months and to extend it by additional 3 months provided that Parliament approves. And so when you look at the Constitution, the maximum period for the state of emergency is 6 months. Now, this government declared the state of emergency in 2017 for 3 months, extended it for additional 3 months, and the 6 months were over a few days ago. So what did the government do? It waited for a few days and declared the state of emergency anew. Of course, tricking, manipulating the constitutional text. There is a gap, a gray zone in the constitutional text which this government manipulated or is manipulating effectively. So we are into month 7, state of emergency, and of course many Egyptians fear that this is going to be once again, especially against the background of the war on terror and different actually terrible terrorist attacks, that this is going to give the government a free pass to continue extending the state of emergency. In the state of emergency, citizens' rights are undermined. One of the key features I'm referring to in relation to labor activism is the fact that the state of emergency enables the government to establish special emergency tribunals, where judges are not the civil judges we know, but judges can come to an extent from the security apparatus, and where citizens' rights to appeal court verdicts are not granted. So in special emergency tribunals, there is no appeal, there is no right to appeal. And this is increasingly going to be part of the scene of the political reality in Egypt in the next few months. Final set of tools used are judicial tools, transferring protesting workers, civil servants to criminal courts. Criminal courts have been handing down various prison sentences for labor activists. Administrative courts have been issuing rulings that, in fact, legalize punishing workers and civil servants who participate in protests with arbitrary retirement. It's one of the most depressing rulings coming out of the administrative court system. And the administrative court system in Egypt gets a great deal of praise for being liberal oriented. Some of the rulings which came out in the last 4 years are quite troubling because they have been legalizing the repressive government practice of retiring in an arbitrary fashion protesting workers and civil servants. Administrative courts, in fact, corresponding to the government will also issued a ruling delegalizing independent labor unions. We have a gray zone now with regard to existing independent labor unions, and that gray zone is probably going to be ended in the new labor law, which is being debated right now in Parliament. But we have court rulings from an administrative court system delegalizing their existence. Some of these labor unions persist up until now, but ultimately the final word will be enshrined in the new labor law. And probably it's going to go in the direction of outlawing independent labor unions. It's important to keep in mind that the current president looks at the 1950s and 1960s as the ideal period he would like to go back to. Not in a social or an economic sense. He does not have a similar project to Egypt's under Nasser, but in the sense of the government controlling the different spaces of activism in which citizens participate. NGOs and civil societies should be controlled completely by the government, or should be forced to fear and suffer constant repressive measures. Workers and civil servants have to be, once again, co-opted in a general union for Egyptian workers. Independent labor unions should no longer be allowed to operate, and so on and so forth. In fact, there are some interesting statements which the current president made referring back to the 1960s at two levels. Civil society, so activism in general, and media, wishing back the 1960s, wishing back that one man, one voice, one authority, dominant vis-a-vis society sort of times. Finally, very troubling with regard to judicial tools are military trials. So the picture you're seeing is for protesting workers of the Alexandria shipyard, previously owned by the government, currently owned by the army. The army is a big owner in the Egyptian economy. And workers in the Alexandria shipyard protested in 2016, delayed salaries, that there were no salary increases offered, and so for different economic and financial demands. The response came by getting the military police. These are red uniformed, beige red uniformed young men you can see in the picture, to basically take control of the facility, and different leading workers leading in the protests were transferred to the military trials. Their trial continues to go on as of now. There is no verdict which has been announced yet. Different times it was postponed. So the last time I checked was actually yesterday. So a verdict is scheduled for soon, but this has been postponed several times. So these are the four groups of tools which this government has been extensively and systematically using: administrative, security, legislative and judicial tools to demobilize and depoliticize the Egyptian working class and civil servants. Let me close off by saying, once again, this is part of only one component of a wider picture in Egypt, in which this current government is trying to drive the Egyptian society back not only to pre-2011 realities, actually to pre-1970s and 1980s realities. So this government, in the second half of the 1970s, partial political pluralism was introduced to Egypt by former President Sadat. It was sustained more or less in the 1980s, 90s, and the last decade of former President Mubarak. This government is out to not only to ridicule formal politics or ridicule former semi-pluralist politics, but also to reinsert its control, its one-sided control over civil society, over media, over labor activism, in a manner which would take Egypt back to the 1950s and 1960s. By some accounts, realities unfolding on the ground are even worse when we look at human rights violations and the reported degree of violence by the security forces as well as by the government in general.
Thank you, Amr, and thank you, Hisham and CDDRL for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. I'm in agreement with about 95% of what Amr said. The situation is very, very grim. The one piece, I'm going to talk about three things. The first is numbers and statistics, and that's the one piece where I might disagree a little bit with Amr. Then I'm going to talk about the structure of strikes and protest, and finally some macroeconomic issues. So Amr and I were talking before we began about the difficulty of coming up with some reasonably accurate figure for how many workers' collective actions there are in any given time frame. Different NGOs historically had different numbers because they counted differently, and now it's become, as Amr said, even more difficult because reporters can't go to strike sites and workers won't talk to people and so on. But this is kind of unclarity in statistics in Egypt is, I would argue, intentional. It amplifies the sense that nobody knows what's happening. So Amr said the statistics for labor protests are more or less accurate. I would say they're accurate to a degree of magnitude. Amr said the state bureaucracy is now 6.6 million. Perhaps 7 million, because the government doesn't tell the truth. But the same agency that Amr cited reported to the press not too long ago that the number of civil service employees has declined from 5.8 million in fiscal year 2015-2016 to 5 million in fiscal year 2016-2017, a decline of 13%. Why are they doing that? Because the World Bank and the IMF want to hear that. Is that actually true? I don't know. So people see these different apparently authoritative looking numbers, and it enhances the sense. I don't know what's happening to us. We can't explain. No, inflation. Amr said inflation was 30% annual year on year in January, but 15% now. Trading economics, which is sort of neutral and not beholden to the government of Egypt or to the international financial institutions, reported not too long ago that inflation in September was 31.6 and did not decrease below 30% in any single month throughout 2017. What's the rate of inflation of Egypt? No one has ever come up with a remotely accurate figure for something like that. Similarly, for the rate of unemployment, we don't know. So the social scientists, I guess, would call this a dirty data set. But this is intentional because it is a tool that the government uses to enhance its control over people. Second, the structural character of workers' collective actions. So Amr emphasized, and is totally correct in this, that after the democratic uprising of January 2011, the percentage of political demands in protests by workers increased up to perhaps 40% in 2012. Although what's the definition of a political demand is also not black and white. So that's a change, but it's perhaps not the most important change. If we go back to the period before 2011, roughly the decade before, because it's 1998 when the trend line for labor protests began to go up sharply over what it had been in the 1980s and 1990s, so from about 30 strikes a year to well over 100 for the rest of the decade, and in several years as many as 500 and 600 and 700. This is before 2011. So not only did the number go up, but there were other very important changes here. And here I'm relying on the model that the late Charles Tilly and Fred Shorter put forward in their book Strikes in France, where they do this kind of study of the shape of strike action. So in the 2000s, before 2011, the number of strikes as a proportion of all different kinds of protests increased. So the most common form of protest is a sit-in at the factory, which continued and continues, but during the 2000s, the number of actual work stoppages increased. Not only that, in the 1980s and 1990s, and now again, if there is a strike, it tends to be very short. One day, and the authorities come in and smash it. In the 2000s, there were some strikes that lasted as long as 5 months. So why is this important? And many lasted for a week or 2 weeks. Why is this important? Because strikes give people an opportunity to work together, to learn what democracy is in action, because they have to take a strike vote. They have to decide, are we accepting this offer or not? Who is going to negotiate on our behalf with whoever agrees to negotiate with us? And all sorts of things. Who's going to arrange for the food to be brought to the factory? And so a whole lot of practice in behaving democratically happens if a strike lasts for longer than a day or two. So it's very important to look not only at the number of strikes, but how long they last, because that gives people the opportunity to build up a political leadership. So in the 2000s, raising political demands was pretty rare. There were some important exceptions, some very important exceptions even at Mahal al-Kubr, the textile complex, which is the largest single factory complex in Egypt and perhaps in the entire Middle East. But generally speaking, economic demands dominated. Nonetheless, workers could very easily cross the line. People, journalists, when I was directing the Middle East Studies program at American University in Cairo in the mid-2000s, journalists would come to me and say, well, is the strike movement, if they even knew it existed, going to become political? Or when is it going to become political? And I would say, in an autocracy, if large numbers of people are doing the same thing at the same time, and the government doesn't want them to do it, that's political. It doesn't matter what their specific demand is. So when a little bit of space opened up after January 2011, yeah, it was very easy to move into making political demands. And there was a lot of debate about what kind of political demands and so forth and so on. And so when Amr mentioned that Kamal Abu Etta, who had been elected the president of the Egyptian Federation of Independent Trade Unions, became Minister of Manpower. So there was a big debate. Is this a good thing because he represents us and he will convince the government to meet some of our demands? Or is it a bad thing because we've had a military coup and democracy has just been trashed? So that debate will no longer happen in public, if at all, because, as Amr very correctly said, society has been depoliticized to a very substantial extent. Last point, macroeconomic questions. Employment in Egypt is actually declining. And in particular, female participation in the wage labor force. And the reason for that is, as in the United States, so in Egypt, the public sector is the most female-friendly sector. So as the public sector shrinks in Egypt, female wage labor force participation shrinks. So it was 26.3% in 1990, not high for an upper mid-level developing country to begin with. It's down to 23.1% in 2016. Those women who do work in the private sector, so who aren't secretaries or administrators in the government bureaucracy and such things, overwhelmingly work in the textile and garment sector. Egypt has, again with the statistics you'll understand now, about 1,500 garment factories. Some are very, very large. Halal Kubra has still somewhere between 15 and 20,000 workers, and some are very, very small. There are altogether about 1.5 million textile workers. Since 2011, about 4,500 factories, most of them textile factories, we don't have precise statistics on this, are standing idle. Why? Because foreign direct investment was involved in establishing many of those factories, and it went home. Oh, we're going to have terrorism and instability and whatnot, so no, we're not keeping our money here. And of course, also cronies of Gamal Mubarak, President Mubarak's younger son, who had been given all sorts of advantages in investment opportunities. They took their money and ran to the extent that they could. Government is, of course, aware of this, and the current Minister of Manpower, Mohammed Sa'afan, proudly announced a few months ago 186 factories out of the 4,500 or so which are idle have been registered as a part of a plan to reactivate closed factories. So that's an expression of how utterly inadequate the Egyptian government's effort to deal with the macroeconomic problem is. What is the plan? Some people are thinking about how Egypt will get out of this. According to the international financial institutions, the plan is exactly what it was before 2011. That is, the government has established all sorts of special economic zones. The latest one is the new Suez Canal economic zone, which there are very wildly different reports on the progress of its construction and what is going on. And foreign direct investment is supposed to come to these places and hire Egyptian workers, and that's going to suck up all of the people who have been made unemployed by the shrinking of the public sector. In particular, there is a lot of fanfare around qualified industrial zones that were established in 1996. These were zones where if 10.5% of a product's value came from Israel, and at least 35% of the value added of the product was local, meaning Egyptian or Israeli, then the products overwhelmingly garments could be exported duty-free and quota-free to the United States. And big companies, Levi Strauss, Walmart, Phillips Van Heusen, Gap, Nike, JCPenney, subcontracted to have garments produced under these conditions. Now, this was supposed to do many things, among them cement the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, which that has not really happened. The threat of Iran is what has cemented the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, and that's a whole different story. So these QIZs absorbed, before 2011, little bit less than the same number of public sector textile workers who lost their jobs as a result of the privatization of the public sector. So there is no particular reason to think that this sort of mechanism is going to be any more successful going forward than it was during the 2000s. Does that mean that we are inevitably heading to another uprising or something like that? Absolutely not, because I made the mistake as early as the early 1980s thinking, no, this cannot last. But it lasted a long time. Will it last forever? No, it will not last forever. Thank you.